I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to talk about American history after the year 2000, going through the election of 2000 and then laying out the basic foreign and domestic policy challenges of the Bush years. So, here's your objectives for today. Take a moment to take them in, and let's move on. The election of 2000, obviously Bill Clinton is term limited, and so the Democrats are going to go with his vice presidential candidate, Al Gore of Tennessee. The Republicans are going to nominate another George Bush Jr., often known as George W. Bush. He was the previous governor of Texas, and he's running, partially on name recognition and partially on, being the governor of a large, relatively conservative state. Whereas Al Gore is running to some degree on the success of the Clinton administration. The battle between Bush and Gore was one partially about ideology, with Bush representing the basic Republican platform of smaller government, lower taxes, personal responsibility, things like that, and Gore representing, to some extent, the success of the Clinton years, increased government intervention, action on climate change, things like that. And so, but it was also partially about personality, whereas Al Gore came off as sort of very wooden and lacking charisma. Bush came off as very sort of folksy and personable and was able to kind of connect with the American people. You could definitely go and watch the political ads from these two campaigns, and you should probably go do that to get a sense of this. We're not going to show them here, but definitely go watch Bush and Gore campaign ads. And you should probably also, at some point, if you've never seen it, you should definitely go watch the SNL on the first presidential debate with Will Ferrell. It really encapsulates the way the American public viewed both of these candidates. The end result of this is this electoral result. It was a spectacularly close election, with Bush winning a narrow plurality of the popular vote, and Gore winning a narrow plurality of the popular vote, and Bush winning a narrow sort of victory in the electoral vote. The real controversy over the election of 2000, which again is one of the closest presidential contests in American history, was the state of Florida. Jeb Bush was the current governor of the state of Florida, and there was some questions about voting issues in the state of Florida because the state of Florida was incredibly close, as you can see here is won by George Bush. There was questions about the legitimacy of the count in some counties, with voting machines inaccurately counting votes, and the part that was supposed to punch out a ballot, the hole on the ballot, leaving what were called hanging chads, these sort of this little piece of paper that might have interfered with the count. And there was also some questions about poll changes, polling hours, things like that. In the end, there was some question about the count in the state of Florida. There was an automatic recount. The Gore campaign sued in order to, get the recount, continue the recount. The Bush campaign sued to stop the recount. And in the end, the Supreme Court ended up ruling, giving the election to George Bush, which Gore then conceded. It was an incredibly close election, and for some people, this is still somewhat controversial. Bush is going to pass a massive education reform bill called No Child Left Behind. The goal of No Child Left Behind is to improve the standard of education by setting clear goals that schools have to try to attain, what's called adequate yearly progress. The benefit of this is that it should hold schools accountable because there's not really a national system of school accountability in the United States. And so No Child Left Behind attempted to push schools, especially schools that are struggling, to set reasonable goals and then demonstrate progress towards that goals. The downside of No Child Left Behind is that its critics say it put too much emphasis on standardized testing, and it could potentially cut funding to schools that did not make adequate yearly progress. So schools that were already struggling would also have financial issues to deal with and could be shut down or have the administration completely replaced by in order to try to get them back on track. And so No Child Left Behind is still controversial. And in the United States, we still really struggle with this question of what does school accountability look like? And we don't have a good sense of that, really. Bush is also going to have an answer for the great surpluses that we had under the Clinton years. So here's Bush's plan for the surpluses. Take a moment, pause, and read. Hopefully, this looks somewhat familiar to you because he's trying to call back to Ronald Reagan and push trickle down economics. The Bush tax cuts were pretty substantial. They ended up giving a lot of the deficit back to Americans, which did spur some economic growth. But what we didn't see is the massive amount of economic growth for the 1980s, and we did not see the tax cuts pay for themselves. Instead, we ended up continuing to run substantial deficits, and we're on a path of fiscal unsustainability that we're, still currently on. So that's the Bush tax cuts, some economic growth, and consistent deficits. The dot-com bubble bursts, leading to a short recession. This one is not super severe. The bursting of the dot-com bubble was, predictable in that they discovered that, internet content companies like Pets.com didn't have any actual real revenue, and so the valuation of them dropped significantly. We also survived the Y2K crisis. It turns out this computer glitch in which dates were recorded with 2 digits instead of 3 digits did not cause planes to fall out of the sky. And so we managed to survive that in 2000 somehow. And then the world profoundly changed forever on September 11th. Take a moment, pause, and read. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with the September 11th terror attacks. Terrorists from a group called Al Qaeda were hijacked 4 planes, 2 of which flew into the World Trade Center towers, 1 crashed into the Pentagon, and 1 crashed in a field in Pennsylvania, with analysts thinking it was headed for maybe the White House or the Capitol. This stunning act of terror shook Americans out of their complacency of the 1990s and profoundly changed the course of American society. We discovered that the terror attacks were committed by, again, a group called Al Qaeda, led by a guy named Osama bin Laden. And this launched a global war on terror, where the United States decided to use its vast military resources to go and try to root out sources of terror to prevent future attacks like this from happening in the future. We also created a new cabinet-level agency called the Department of Homeland Security, and we beefed up airport security pretty significantly with admittedly mixed results. So the TSA is also going to have significantly more resources to hopefully prevent terror attacks like this from happening in the future. We also decided to invade Afghanistan. Afghanistan in the 1990s had fallen to a group of religious extremists known as the Taliban. The Taliban had only marginal control over large portions of Afghanistan, with local sort of leaders ruling a lot of the local provinces. And this was one of the places where Al Qaeda was training the people who carried out the September 11th attacks. And so the Bush administration decided to overthrow the Taliban in order to try to eliminate this safe haven for terrorists in Afghanistan. In the end, they were able to overthrow the Taliban relatively quickly, although nation building in Afghanistan and pacifying large areas of the very sort of rural, decentralized, mountainous, difficult parts of Afghanistan would continue for a number of years. And honestly, the Afghan war is, we'll come back and talk about it, I guess. I'm not going to get into the whole details of it here. In 2003, we also decided to invade the nation of Iraq. This one is somewhat more problematic because the motivation for invading Iraq was somewhat misstated. Famously, Colin Powell went in front of the United Nations and claimed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. The Bush administration also claimed that he was providing funding and safe haven for terrorists. It turned out that none of these things were really true. We were able to destabilize and overthrow Saddam's regime relatively quickly, although the transition to democracy in Iraq was much more problematic because, again, Iraq is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state that it's very difficult to develop a general consensus about what a government should do. And so the government in Iraq became very unstable in the aftermath of this, and the dissolution of Saddam's political party, the Ba'ath Party, really contributed to the instability in Iraq, as did the disbanding of the Iraqi army. So all of those decisions, in hindsight, don't look particularly good, although the overthrow of Saddam's regime was effective, and originally the Iraqi people had a sense of hope and optimism with the overthrow of the dictator who'd been in charge of Iraq for decades. Nation building in the Middle East became incredibly problematic. Saddam was put on trial for his crimes. But trying to create a stable democracy in either Iraq or Afghanistan has been kind of problematic for us. And I mean, in the end, there's degrees to which the governments have been stable. Iraq to this day has significant problems with corruption and faith in their government, also providing governmental services. And we'll definitely talk about the whole ISIS thing once we get past 2010. Afghanistan is a whole different animal that we'll try to deal with here. So, the ethnic, religious, and sectarian divides within a lot of these Middle Eastern countries lead to challenges in trying to transition them into Western style democracies. And the Iraq War, because of this, dragged on for a number of years. And, we really struggled to stabilize the situation in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And the wars dragged on and on. When I had first started teaching this class and talking about these issues, Iraq seemed to be the more disastrous situation. Although, obviously, in the past, year, Afghanistan has become even less of a success story. So we'll deal with both of those things as we get to them. The U.S. also, in its war on terror, decided to use its military base in Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, to hold terror suspects. We held these people for long periods of time without trial, and the Bush administration was known for using what are called advanced interrogation techniques, specifically waterboarding, sleep deprivation, things like that, in order to attempt to get information out of these suspects. Since then, we have reevaluated some of these policies, and questions remain as to whether or not this should be categorized as torture and to what extent we should be involved in these things. George Bush also passed the Patriot Act, which is the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act of 2001, which gave significant power to the government and specifically the National Security Agency, the NSA, to surveil both foreign threats and also Americans. This is going to be revealed. This increased surveillance is going to be revealed, similarly kind of shaking America's faith in their government, similar to what we saw with the Pentagon Papers and the revealing of sort of the CIA's misactions prior to the 1970s. The Bush Doctrine is pretty straightforward. This is sort of our unilateral intervention in a number of these places. Bush had general sort of global consensus for the invasion of Afghanistan. We invoked the NATO Charter, Article 5, in order to get a NATO force to go into Afghanistan. The invasion of Iraq was much more polarizing globally. And the United States got significant pushback and criticism from the global establishment for our potentially reckless intervention in countries in order to try to fight this war on terror. And so the Bush Doctrine kind of breaks down the Cold War consensus building and basically has us go it alone, which, again, for critics of U.S. neoconservative foreign policy, they would argue that these were poorly thought out decisions and that much of this was probably a mistake. Here's Bush's statement on the Bush Doctrine. So pause, read. Let's keep moving on. For the election of 2004, Bush is going to run for re-election, with the main issues being the war on terror. And, honestly, the main issues being the war on terror. Bush is going to run against Democrat John Kerry, who you might remember as being one of the leaders of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. He gave the statement that we read earlier when we were talking about the Vietnam War, about potential war crimes happening in Vietnam. And one of the key issues, besides the traditional Democrat-Republican divide, was Kerry's war record. A group called Swift Boat Veterans for Truth ran a series of ads attacking John Kerry for his opposition to the Vietnam War. And they said some misleading things about his Vietnam War record that really hurt his credibility. And so swift boating became sort of a colloquial phrase for using misleading advertising to kind of undermine a candidate. You should definitely go and read or watch the Swift Boat Veterans ad against John Kerry. It's, again, it's not, there's no mistruths in it, but the mischaracterization of some of the stuff, it's an interesting framing, and you should definitely check it out. Bush was criticized for his folksy nature. He became, for a lot of people, this was somewhat lovable. They became known as Bushisms. Bush was much less polished speaker than Americans were used to in their public figures. Again, recently, this has really changed, and our expectation as far as our public speakers being able to string together a coherent sentence has substantially eroded. But Bush really had a number of these sort of embarrassing statements that many Americans thought were unpresidential. He also tried to give Angela Merkel of Germany a very awkward back rub. And so, for a lot of people, this demonstrated that Bush was not mentally up to the task of being president. Although, again, our bar for this has substantially shifted over time. The election of 2004. Here's the results. Bush wins a very, very narrow victory over John Kerry, winning most of the states that he carried the last time, and he gets another 4 years in office. One of the things that really harmed Bush in his second term was Hurricane Katrina. This massive hurricane striking Louisiana created mass devastation. And the criticism of the Bush administration is that their response was too slow and too targeted on specific groups of people. Famously, Kanye West on a telethon about helping out hurricane relief stated that George Bush doesn't care about black people. And this had been the persistent criticism of the Bush administration, that for the black residents of New Orleans, the aid came very slowly, very haphazardly, and that this really negatively affected their lives and demonstrated the Bush's either organizational incompetence or, at worst, complete neglect of certain communities. Then you've got the housing crash. During the Bush administration, deregulation of the mortgage industry led to the building up of a housing bubble. Flipping homes became a big business, with people buying homes as speculative assets to sell them later when the price rose. And so people were buying homes that they could not afford in order to sell them for a profit. These mortgages were then being divided up and sold as investments to other people, basically hiding the fact that a lot of these mortgages were toxic, and if the people couldn't sell the homes quickly, they would not be able to. They would default on the mortgages, and the value would significantly drop. This housing bubble burst in 2007 with the collapse of the housing market. This left a lot of people what are called underwater on their homes, where they owed more money on the house than the house was worth. So they had a mortgage they couldn't afford, and even if they sold the house, they could not pay off that mortgage. This was absolutely devastating, leading to the collapse of a series of mortgage industries. It led to huge amounts of foreclosures, people losing their homes, losing substantial assets, and kicking off a massive economic crisis called the Great Recession. The US economy greatly contracted during this time period. The job market became much more tight. Unemployment rose substantially. And, just to pull out a random example, if you happen to graduate from college with a degree right during this time, you probably spent some time working in the service industry, grilling steaks at a steakhouse, as opposed to working in the mortgage and finance industry, which is what you originally got your degree to do. And then, maybe you eventually got a job as a teacher, just hypothetically. So, Great Recession led to significant economic problems for a whole host of different Americans and different reasons. Bush's job rating tanks here. Obviously, after 9/11, there was a rally around the president effect, and the same thing during the launching of the Iraq War. But by the end of George Bush's term, his approval rating was sitting somewhere around 30%, and the Republican brand was looking much less strong. So that's where we'll end for today. And we'll talk about the new direction that we get with the election of 2008 and the Democrats retaking control of the White House. So we'll leave you there. Thank you for listening.